Navigation Acts were a group of British laws beginning in 1651 that restricted foreign ships. The first two rules were introduced by Oliver Cromwell and stated that only English ships could transport goods from outside Europe, and goods from inside Europe could only be shipped by English ships and ships from the originating countries. It also excluded the Dutch from all trade with Britain. American colonies were forbidden from directly exporting their products to non-English consumers. The Navigation Acts were very unpopular among the colonists, and resentments against the act was one of the causes of the American Revolutionary War. Conflict between Great Britain and other countries continued to rise in the 1700s. The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, took place between 1754 and 1763 in North America. It actually lasted 9 years. The conflict was between the British, led by James Wolfe, and the French, led by Louis Joseph de Montcalm, fighting for land in the Ohio River Valley, near present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The war resulted in victory for Great Britain, so the British colonists no longer needed protection from the French. The war officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on February 10, 1763. The British imposed taxes on the colonists to help pay for its military debts. This war would also become one of the greatest causes of the American Revolution. As a result of the French and Indian War, there was land that was captured by Britain from France. The Proclamation of 1763 was issued on October 7th by King George III to prohibit settlement by the British colonists on land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Its purpose was to avoid conflict with Native Americans. Yet the proclamation was eventually ignored, and the colonists continued to object to the British government. This event would continue to add fuel to the coming of the American Revolution. Less than a year later, Great Britain issued the Sugar Act on April 5, 1764, to continue gaining money to pay its debts after the French and Indian War. The act was also known as the American Revenue Act. It was an extension of the Molasses Act of 1733, which was about to expire in 1763. The Sugar Act imposed a 3-cent tax on foreign refined sugar and increased tax on coffee, indigo, and certain kinds of wine. Colonists began to smuggle non-British goods in order to avoid taxes from Parliament. Because the colonists did not have a say on their tax laws, this event led to many protests and boycotts on British goods. On March 22, 1765, another bill was passed by British Parliament, imposing more taxes on American colonies. Once again, trying to recover from severe debt of the 7 Years' War, Britain declared the Stamp Act, which declared all printed matter, including playing cards, must have a government stamp sold by the colonial governors. Of course, this was strongly opposed, especially the newspaper companies. As a result, Parliament removed the Stamp Act a year later on March 18, 1766. Yet this event would lead to more disputes between the British Parliament and the American colonies. Another event that resulted from the French and Indian War was the Quartering Act on May 15, 1765. Because the British officers had trouble paying for quartering and supplies for the troops, they forced American colonists to house and feed their soldiers. Of course, the colonists disputed the legality of this act because it violated the Bill of Rights in 1689. 1,500 British troops arrived in New York City in 1766, but the New York Provincial Assembly refused to obey the Quartering Act. British troops were forced to stay on their ships. The act would later expire on March 24, 1767. As a result of the repealing of the Sugar Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act on the same day, March 18, 1766. It stated that Parliament's authority was the same in America as it was in Britain, and gave the government the power to pass laws on the American colonies. Throughout the 1760s, British Parliament kept trying to get the colonies to pay for themselves. Its efforts continued with the passing of the Townshend Acts between June 15th and July 2nd in 1767. These laws were introduced by Charles Townshend in hopes of raising money to pay for the salaries of British officials. Yet he would never see the results of his acts because he died in September of 1767. The laws placed new taxes on paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. They established on the American Customs Board in Boston to collect taxes and set up new courts in America to prosecute smugglers. They also took away some freedoms from the colonists by giving British officials the right to search the colonists' houses and businesses. The slogan "No taxation without representation" became widely used as the American colonists once again protested and continued to be pushed towards revolution. The imposing of all these taxes led to the increased boycott of British goods. Protests in Boston turned violent on March 5, 1770, when arguments escalated between British Private Hugh White and a few colonists on King Street. British soldiers opened fire on a group of American colonists. 5 men were killed. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a runaway slave who became a sailor. Among those arrested were 8 British soldiers who awaited a trial for murder, which began on November 27, 1770. American lawyer John Adams agreed to represent them, believing they should receive a fair trial. He argued the soldiers had the right to defend themselves. Only 2 of the soldiers were found guilty. The Boston Massacre became an event of patriotism among the colonists. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty were formed to fight for freedom against the British rule, yet another event that would lead to the American Revolution. On December 16, 1773, the protests against British government took to the Boston harbor, where colonists disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and threw 342 chests of tea into the water. They boarded 3 ships carrying 90,000 pounds of tea, equivalent to $1 million in today's money. The Boston Tea Party was a huge protest against the British goods because the colonists were forced to only buy tea from East India Trading Company. They also had to pay large taxes on the tea as a result of the Tea Act. No one really knows who planned the Boston Tea Party, but there had been a big town meeting led by Samuel Adams earlier that day to discuss the taxes. Paul Revere was among one of those who participated. As a punishment for the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts on March 24, 1774. They were called the Intolerable Acts because the Americans could no longer tolerate such unfair laws. In Britain, they were known as the Coercive Acts. These included 1. The Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston to all ships. 2. The Massachusetts Government Act, which changed its government, giving more power to the British governor. 3. The Administration of Justice Act. 4. The Corn Act. And 5. The Quebec Act, which expanded the British Canadian territory. In response to the Intolerable Acts, the First Continental Congress called upon its first meeting. While the British were hoping to maintain control in America, it caused the opposite effect, as the colonies began to unite and rebel. The final events leading to the American Revolution. And so began the first battle of the American Revolutionary War. On April 19, 1775, as the British set out from Boston to capture rebels in Lexington and destroy the American store of weapons and ammunition at Concord, the colonists were warned by Paul Revere riding through the night. The Battle of Lexington was not a very big fight, but the site became famous because it was the beginning of the Revolutionary War, led by Captain John Parker. The 80 American militiamen, also known as Minutemen, were forced to flee because they were outnumbered by the British. About 25% of Parker's men were actually his relatives. The British soldiers, also known as Redcoats because of their red uniforms, were forced to fight. Some fired the first shot of the American Revolution, which became the shot heard around the world, in a poem by Ralph Waldo Emerson, even though no one is sure who fired the shot. After the Americans left Lexington, the British marched into Concord and began to search the town for weapons. While the Americans waited their attack, they finally defeated the British at North Bridge, giving the Americans hope for an independent future.